Mike Scott, 18 wins, 306 strikeouts, a 2.22 ERA, and a division-clinching no-hitter. He was named NLCS MVP for a losing team. On paper, one of the most dominant seasons ever. This isn't about a great pitcher, but a mediocre one who found an illegal edge and used it so brilliantly, he never got caught. But was it real? Let's find out. Go back to 1984. Mike Scott is 29 years old. 5 wins, 11 losses, and about to be released from professional baseball. Have you ever felt completely stuck with your lifelong dreams slowly slipping away? That was Mike Scott for his first 6 major league seasons. Back in his college days at Pepperdine University, Scott was actually an elite prospect who threw a perfect game during his junior season in 1975. Drafted by the New York Mets in the second round of the 1976 draft, he made it to the major leagues in 1979. The 1979 Mets were a struggling team that won only 63 games, but they possessed a highly promising young pitching staff featuring Scott, Jeff Reardon, Jesse Orosco, and Neil Allen. Yet, Scott spent 4 highly forgettable seasons in New York. He was a pitcher who simply couldn't figure it out on the mound. He possessed a straight 95-mile-per-hour fastball, but in the major leagues, a straight fastball without movement is highly vulnerable. His record with the Mets spoke for itself. 14 wins, 27 losses, and a bloated 4.81 earned run average. He was not a project. He was a complete write-off. The Mets eventually decided they had seen enough. On December 10th, 1982, they traded him to the Houston Astros in exchange for reserve outfielder Danny Heap. To the Mets, this was a disposal, not a deal. They were simply unloading a struggling 28-year-old arm, hoping to get any utility value they could in return. Astros general manager Al Rosen compared Scott to Joaquin Andujar, hoping Scott could find similar success after being traded, but when Scott arrived in Houston, his performance initially showed no dramatic improvement. He had 2 quiet Houston seasons with only marginal improvements. A 10-win season with a 3.72 ERA in 1983. But he quickly took a massive step backward, finishing with a dismal 5 wins, 11 losses, and a 4.68 ERA in 1984. By the end of that painful 1984 campaign, Scott was 29 years old, sitting on the absolute edge of being released from professional baseball altogether. He had no identity as a pitcher and no reason for anyone to believe he had one coming. But when your career is on life support, desperation forces you to look for answers. That was when Scott reached out to Roger Craig, the pitching coach who had just been let go by Detroit after winning the 1984 World Series. The connection came from teammate Enos Cabell, who noticed Scott had a similar physical build and arm strength to Jack Morris, who had revitalized his career under Craig. Craig agreed to spend 8 days teaching him the split-finger fastball in San Diego. The split finger is a cousin to the forkball, but you throw it with the exact same arm speed and motion as your regular fastball. To the batter's brain, it looks like a standard 95-mile-per-hour heater. But at the last second, because of the reduced backspin, the pitch drops off a table at 88 miles per hour, diving straight down toward the batter's ankles. It was a pitch that Scott would later say saved his life in baseball, leading him to declare, "God bless Roger Craig." The split finger explains some of the transformation, but it doesn't explain all of it. By 1986, Scott wasn't just good, he was untouchable. And an entire league was starting to ask, why? How does a pitcher go from a career-threatening 4.68 ERA to being the most feared man in the National League almost overnight? Let's look at the first warning signs in 1985. Scott went 18-8 with a 3.29 ERA in his age 30 season. His strikeout rate literally doubled. On the surface, the split-finger fastball was the official explanation, and most of baseball accepted it without a second thought. But did the rest of the league ignore the warning signs? In May of 1985, during one of Scott's starts at Wrigley Field, a piece of sandpaper was found near the pitcher's mound. On May 26th, Cubs manager Jim Frey had umpire John Kibler check Scott on the mound after players saw something drop from Scott's glove. After the inning was over, Frey said that his first baseman, Leon Durham, found a small piece of sandpaper near the mound. It was brand new, meticulously cut into a perfect circle, and just the right size to hide inside a glove. Frey sent an advisory letter with the sandpaper to the National League president Chub Feeney, but nobody in a league office acted. Then came 1986. The season that strains credulity. The Houston Astros, widely projected by experts to finish last, won 96 games. Scott was the absolute engine driving their success. He won 18 games, led the National League with 306 strikeouts, and posted a microscopic league-leading 2.22 ERA. He threw 5 shutouts and logged a massive 275 innings of work. The dominance reached its peak on September 25, 1986, when Scott threw a no-hitter against the San Francisco Giants to clinch the division title. He struck out 13 batters and walked absolutely no one. The dome was electric, but the mood in the Giants' dugout was one of pure boiling frustration. Immediately after the final out was recorded, Giants catcher Bob Brenly stated that the Giants were actively collecting scuffed balls from the game as physical evidence of cheating. Have you ever wondered what a scuffed baseball actually does to a hitter? When you introduce a tiny scratch or abrasion on the smooth surface of a baseball, you create drag asymmetry. As the ball travels through the air at high speed, the air flows cleanly over the smooth side, but creates a turbulent pocket over the scuffed side. This pressure differential causes the ball to break laterally in an erratic, highly unpredictable path. It doesn't break like a standard slider or curveball. Instead, it darts sideways at the very last microseconds. Batters simply can't sit on the pitch because its trajectory defies natural physics. And the beauty of this deception is that it's almost impossible for an umpire to detect during a live game. A pitcher can scuff a ball, throw a devastating pitch, and then immediately watch it get fouled away. By the time the umpire actually inspects a ball, the physical evidence is already 3 pitches old. The art isn't the scratch itself, it's concealing the instrument used to make it. Think about how much anxiety this created for opposing teams. Paranoia was spreading throughout the league. In September of 1986, Cincinnati Reds starter Tom Browning picked up a warm-up ball in Houston and claimed it had a massive quarter-sized scuff mark that could not have been accidental. The bullpen became a theater of the absurd. In fact, the suspicion was so widespread that Mets reliever Roger McDowell once showed up to the bullpen wearing a full carpenter's belt loaded with sandpaper, a file, and a chisel to mock the league's sudden crackdowns. But while the Astros laughed off the accusations, their next opponents were not amused, and Scott was never found with one. The Mets had studied Scott all season. They had a plan for the NLCS. By the end of Game 1, that plan was in the garbage. When the 1986 National League Championship Series began, the Mets' fear of Mike Scott loomed psychologically over every game he didn't pitch. New York was the best team in baseball, boasting 108 wins with Dwight Gooden, Darryl Strawberry, Keith Hernandez, and Gary Carter. Yet, they were afraid of Mike Scott. Not strategically afraid, but psychologically afraid. The entire Mets dugout talked about needing to win before Game 7 because nobody believed they could hit him again in the Astrodome. That fear was itself a weapon. In Games 1 and 4, Scott completely dismantled the best lineup in baseball. Scott won both his starts, allowing just 1 run in 18 combined innings. In Game 1, Scott struck out 14 batters, holding the Mets to 5 hits in a 1-0 shutout. He struck out Hernandez 3 times, Strawberry 3 times, and Carter twice. After striking out, Strawberry walked back to the bench and mumbled, "The guy is unhittable." Mets batters were handing scuffed balls to umpires mid-at-bats. In the first inning, Gary Carter swung at strike 2 and asked plate umpire Doug Harvey to check the ball, believing there was no way it was clean. Harvey examined the ball, turned it over, and tossed it back to Scott, declaring it completely clean. Carter struck out on the next pitch and later admitted he had never felt so dominated by a pitcher. Meanwhile, Keith Hernandez called for an inspection before finishing a swing. Mets second baseman Wally Backman was furious, claiming that every single ball was scuffed and asserting that 15 to 20 scuffed balls couldn't possibly be from fouls. The Mets collected scuffed balls that had been hit into their dugout and turned them over to the league office. Manager Davey Johnson requested that National League President Chub Feeney personally examine 15 of these baseballs. Mets general manager Frank Cashin asked, dripping with sarcasm, "We've been playing this game for 100 years and he just came up with a new pitch?" Chub Feeney investigated and cleared Scott, but promised to monitor the situation. In Game 4, Scott was dominant once again, holding the Mets to just 3 hits in a 3-1 complete game victory. Do you see the supreme irony of that game? The only run the Mets managed to score against him came on an 8th-inning sacrifice fly by Danny Heap, the very player the Mets had traded away 4 years earlier to acquire Mike Scott. With the series tied, the psychological toll was massive. Mets third baseman Ray Knight observed that it was the first time all year he had seen their team not believe in itself. The series ultimately ended before Scott could pitch Game 7. Houston lost Game 6 in a grueling 16-inning thriller, falling 7-6 at the Astrodome in what many call the greatest postseason game ever played. The Mets played with desperate urgency, knowing that if they lost, they would have to face Scott the next day. Once they won, the relief in the Mets clubhouse was massive. Davey Johnson admitted he felt like he had been pardoned and didn't want to see Scott again until next April. Because of their Game 6 victory, Scott never took the mound for a potential Game 7, yet he was named NLCS MVP anyway. He was the first pitcher in history to win the award for the losing team, having held the Mets to a microscopic 189 batting average. Scott was never suspended, never officially found guilty. But 25 years later, in an interview for an MLB Network documentary, he gave an answer that wasn't quite a denial. In 2011, during an MLB Network documentary, Scott was asked directly whether he had scuffed the ball. His answer is the closest we will ever get to closure.
You know, those guys can believe what they want to believe, and I've been hearing this for 25 years, and, well, I'm saying that I've thrown balls that were scuffed, but I haven't scuffed every ball that I've thrown.
In a separate interview, he admitted to scuffing earlier in his career using sandpaper or a nail file, but denied doing so during his legendary 1986 Cy Young season. But think about that denial for a second. Why would a pitcher who had struggled on the verge of retirement suddenly stop using his most effective undetected advantage right at the absolute peak of his professional career? This is where we must understand the Gaylord Perry principle, because Scott understood that the real weapon was the mind game. In 1986, Scott said, "I think the hitters lose some of their concentration when they worry about other things besides hitting. A pitcher who can control what the batter is thinking has already won half the battle before the ball even leaves his hands." Whether or not every single ball was physically doctored, the doubt was real, and it worked flawlessly. But what did the sport ultimately decide to do with him? The result was a classic split verdict. His number 33 was officially retired by the Houston Astros in 1992, and he is in their franchise Hall of Fame. Yet, he's not in Cooperstown. His career record of 124 wins and 108 losses, split between a highly forgettable first act and a dominant second, doesn't command a Hall of Fame vote on its own. The persistent cheating accusations certainly didn't help his case. Baseball gave him the local monument and withheld the national one, a verdict that tells you exactly how the sport processed the whole thing. Mike Scott took an era-defining secret to semi-retirement. Baseball called it a splitter. Batters called it a scuff ball. Umpires called it clean every time they checked. The only person who knows for certain what happened in the Astrodome on those October nights in 1986 is the man who threw the pitches. And he isn't saying. What do you think? Was Mike Scott a master of a legendary pitch, or a genius who cheated his way to a perfect season? Let us know in the comments below. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos, and if you've been watching for a while, hitting that super thanks button helps keep these stories coming.